Hello, this is the Green Corn Rebellion show. I'm Gregory Harden II, and today I'm here with John Waldron, who is a former history teacher and is the current state representative for District 77 in the Oklahoma House of Representatives. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. It's nice to talk to you. And because I'm a history teacher, I really appreciate the name Green Corn Rebellion.
I know, right?
1915. Good, that
Yeah.
was good times. Right now, I would say we're having a seed corn rebellion of the teachers because when it comes to education, we've been eating the seed corn for a long time.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Stop what you're doing. Okay. If you like this video and you like the other content on my channel, please hit the like button on this video. Also, go hit subscribe like right now. And also, when you hit subscribe, click the bell so you can get notifications whenever I put out a new video. So, thanks. All right, enjoy the rest of the video. Yeah, that's cool that someone actually gets the reference to the
Yep.
channel, because I rarely ever meet history teachers who even know
Oh,
about the Green Corn Rebellion.
shoot.
And then whenever I like tell students about what it is, like, oh, never heard of that. I'm like, I know, I didn't learn about it
Oh,
until
no.
college. And the only reason why I ended up learning about it was because I was looking for names for the show. And I was
Oh,
like,
yeah.
oh, okay, this is cool. I'll name it after this. Because it
So
happened.
for those of you listening, it was 1915, and farmers were opposed to the idea that the United States might get involved in the Great War, and they marched on the Capitol and vowed to forage on the way, to eat green corn if it was necessary, because the corn wasn't ripe yet. And the backlash and reaction to the Green Corn Rebellion is sort of the foundation of Oklahoma's conservatism today. We got to remember that our state was founded by progressives, it was founded by socialists, it was founded by populists and radicals, and then it was hijacked by conservatives. And now we have the state that we have today, which doesn't always work for all the Oklahomans.
Yeah, like we didn't really learn much about this in our Oklahoma history class, because I feel like I took a state and local government course whenever
Mm-hmm.
I got to college, took it last year.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I feel like I learned more about Oklahoma history in that class, even though it wasn't an Oklahoma specific class,
Mm.
than I did when I was in high school, because I got to learn about the Constitution of Oklahoma and how it was written and who
Mm-hmm.
helped write it,
Yep.
and how, specific things, the reason why we have like 15 different statewide positions that we vote
Oh,
on,
yeah.
and ballot
Initiatives.
initiatives. Not
Yep.
all states have those, or if
Mm-hmm.
they do, it's not in the same way that Oklahoma does, where
That's right.
the people
If you
get to
have a
put
medical
together.
marijuana card, thank the populists. They made it
Yes.
possible.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting history. Or
Yeah.
what other parts of it? And how, if you read through the different governors of Oklahoma
Mm-hmm.
throughout the years, there's a lot of interesting people,
Yeah.
to say
Alfalfa
the
Bill,
least. Yeah, and
Jack Walton.
yeah, or Jack C. Walton.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of my favorites to talk about,
Mm-hmm.
because he was like super progressive, and then they kicked him out because he tried
Mm-hmm.
to go after the Klan.
Yep. Yep. E.W. Marland. A lot of great
Yeah,
mayors, governors out there. And
yeah.
I'm glad you were able to take that class in college, because we passed a law last year that required us to take anything that might make anyone feel guilty out of the Oklahoma history textbook. And now all we have left are a few pages about a football streak in the 50s.
That I did not learn about whenever I was in school. So maybe that's a good thing.
I guess. Yep.
But no, but yeah, that's cool.
Mm.
So first question I have here is, where are you from and where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Morristown Memorial Hospital in New Jersey, and I grew up in a small town called Bernardsville. And I moved out to Tulsa from Washington, D.C. when I was 30 back in 1999. to teach at a high school, Booker T. Washington High School, go Hornets. I taught there for 20 years, and then I ran for office in 2018.
Cool. So what made you want to teach history?
Oh, well, let's see. I originally intended to work in the consular service, in our embassies overseas. But I was volunteering at a little DC public school. It was run down and really kind of a hippie school. We had no materials, we had no equipment, but we had lots of academic freedom. And I was volunteering there one day a week while I took my exams and my classes and got ready for all the things I was going to do with my career. And then one day I had this epiphany that the thing I was doing volunteering on Wednesday afternoons was the thing that was making me happiest. So I dropped everything else and I became a teacher.
That's cool. So
you probably have a follow-up question about my trajectory from DC to Tulsa.
Probably. I also wanted to know specifically what made you want to teach history. Like, what about history was interesting to you?
History is the good stuff. It's the sum of the human experience. It was my favorite subject in high school, so it became my major in college. And while I went into international affairs in graduate school, I really enjoyed teaching, American history, world history. They're in DC public schools. They have a DC history class, history about one city. And that's fascinating. You would think you'd run out of things to say about a city's history. No, you would not. So there were all kinds of cool stories there. Like in 1848, this group of slaves all escaped from their houses at the same time and got aboard a steamship and tried to make it to free territory and got stopped just shy of the Mason-Dixon line, the Pearl Affair. And it's a neat little bit of DC history. It shows you how race has defined us from the beginning. Since this is not a K-12 classroom, I think I'm still allowed to tell you that.
Yeah. So how did you end up in Tulsa from DC?
Well, I pursued a girl. That's the long and the short of it. I pursued a classmate of mine from GW out to Tulsa.
That's cool. And yeah, let's see. Oh, and I felt like I should mention this because I keep thinking about this almost every other day. You were tweeting a few weeks ago about something.
Yeah,
I can't remember what it was. It was, you said one of your colleagues said something about how jobs
I got into a little
like
trouble.
The 70s or something. It was like 1976 was the year, and then you tweeted like, "Oh, that was when my man Jimmy Carter was president." And then you came back like an hour later and said this tweet didn't age well. And when I read that, because when I was scrolling through Twitter, I just read that attached to the Jimmy Carter tweet. I was thinking, I was like, wait, what does he mean by that? And then I was like, wait, 76 was the election year, not the year he took office. I thought it was hilarious.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And Carter was my man too. I was very embarrassed of making that mistake.
Yeah, that was funny because
I
think I even retweeted it. And then I was like, wait, hold on.
It came down to like, does Carter get the blame or the credit for good things happening in the 70s? And I was quick to jump on Carter's in Carter's defense, only to realize I had gotten the dates wrong.
Yeah, I've done that before.
I'm old enough to have remembered the 76 convention. Because my dad was a politician, he had us watching that stuff. Gerald Ford got up there and he was running for re-election, and he was funny. That's something you don't realize about Gerald Ford, was that he was pretty funny. But Carter was really sincere and earnest, and he really inspired me to get into politics. I mean, even at a young age, I was like, I was delivering newspapers in those days, so I was reading the headlines. But Carter talked like he really cared about people. And that made an impression on me, even when I was a kid.
Yeah, I've read a lot more about Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, I actually did a report on him.
Oh, yeah?
I was in 4th grade.
Oh, my gosh.
And so, and I've read more about him as I've gotten older. And
he's
definitely this has always been true, but he's definitely my favorite former president that's still
Mm.
currently
Oh,
alive.
he's the best ex-president.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
he's what you want to see a former president do.
Yeah, he
After
cured
they're
guinea
in
worm.
office.
He
Yeah,
built houses. He had to set up a peace center. I think he
yeah,
stopped a nuclear war in Korea once. Uh,
yeah.
yeah,
Like he's good.
yeah.
And then what else is there? No, that's funny you say that you were like paying attention to politics when you were that age, because you had to be like 10 or something, or like a little bit
Yeah,
younger
I
than that.
was when Carter left office, I must have been 12 or 13. The hostage crisis had been going on.
Yeah.
I delivered the newspapers, and there was like in those days, the American newspapers had a hostage crisis counter, like how many days has it been? And that would appear in a corner of the newspaper.
Oh wow.
And the whole country was focused.
Yeah. See, I was kind of the same way when it came to politics. Like my parents would
Mm.
have the news on, and so
Yep.
I would watch and I would pay attention. I think I tell people that the first presidential race that I followed kind of closely was the '08 election.
Oh
And I
yeah.
was only like 10 years old, but it
That
was
must have been
Obama.
inspiring.
Yeah, like it was Obama and versus John McCain, and I paid attention to the primary too. And
Hmm.
I think maybe I watched the debates a little bit, I
Yep.
think, but yeah. Um, but I'd been aware of politics before then. Like I remember the '04 election,
Oh yeah.
and but I didn't follow it as closely as the '08 election. It was more
The
like I
04
just knew.
election, I'm speaking over you again. I'm sorry.
No,
You
you go ahead, go ahead.
Expect politicians to do that. 2004 was the first time that the majority of Republican voters in the presidential election were evangelical. I think it's a really important fact because W was, for all his faults, he was trying to change the Republican Party. He delivered some of his speeches in Spanish. He talked about compassionate conservatism. 9/11 happened, and his administration took a right angle turn. And by 2004, the Republican Party was dominated by evangelicals. And I think that's been the case ever since.
Yeah, I didn't even know that was the first election that was the case. But I did know that Bush was not so quick to demonize Muslims and Mexicans at the time, even though his immigration policy was a little sketchy. But
No.
but he wasn't as rhetorically you know, vitriolic towards people as later Republican presidents.
Yeah. And his rhetoric is not something to be misunderestimated.
Yeah. But yeah, I was paying attention to politics for a long time, ever since I was little. I remember a student told me one day, they said, "Oh, the reason why you were paying attention to the '08 election is because back then they didn't have cell phones. Y'all used pagers." I was like, I wasn't that old. I'm not that old, but okay.
That
But
was still the age of the BlackBerry.
yeah, because I remember Obama said that he was gonna take a break from his BlackBerry or something, or try to take a break from his BlackBerry.
They called it Crackberry back then.
Yes.
Yeah.
Episodes of the Green Corn Rebellion Show are sponsored by Oklahoma Progress Now. Oklahoma Progress Now is a 501c4 organization focused on building progressive power in Oklahoma. Their primary efforts are on developing progressive content for a 21st century audience, coalition, and capacity building across progressive organizations and causes, and working to see elected leaders who are more responsive to their constituents and the needs of the many. Areas of focus include progressive messaging and communications, coalition building and resource sharing, and focused progressive policy goals. You can check out their Twitch live streams, and they go live on Facebook at noon, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Please support this organization. It's a really great organization. It's just getting started here in Oklahoma. Thank you. Now enjoy the rest of the video. So what made you want to run for state representative?
Well, that was kind of a road. But my own state representative began recruiting me to fill out his seat after he vacated. And I was a high school teacher. I was happy doing that. He approached me and said, was this something I'd be interested in doing? And I thought and thought about it. And, I kind of had another epiphany like I did when I first became a teacher, which was, your place is in the classroom. So I said no. But then, the education budget got cut every year after 2010. And it just got worse and worse, and the rhetoric from politicians. Finally, somebody popped off and said something that just really lit my fires. And I went and said something dumb on Facebook, and that's how my candidacy started. But that was in 2016, and I ran for state senate against a TU football coach named Dave Rader. And, that carries a lot of weight in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And he was a great candidate too. He and a real gentleman. He worked really hard, and let's face it, the district was leaned Republican, but I kept it close. I lost that election by like 6 points. But at that point, I was in for the fight. I thought, if public education is going to survive in Oklahoma, it has to have defenders. It needs public school teachers to get involved. So that's why I ran again in 2018 in my successful race for House District 77 in the House of Representatives.
That's cool. And tell me about some of the bills you've passed and some of your accomplishments that you've been a part of since you've been in the legislature.
Great. Let me tell you first about the bills I've passed. I haven't passed any bills, but I have been part of a process to get a lot of bills passed. So let's talk a little bit about how that works. The first bill I ever worked on was about getting refrigerated sandwiches from unmanned vending machines in places like airports, Amazon processing centers, etc. You can now get a fresh and delicious refrigerated sandwich better regulated by state law, thanks to people like me. You're welcome. And that's just a great example of the minor tweaks to legislation that the legislature does all the time, and we should appreciate that. Some of the other things I've worked on, as a Democrat, it's very difficult to get bills passed. You have to compromise. You have to find niche issues. You probably can't get much done that involves money. On the other hand, legislators on both parties, and that includes Democrats, can advance issues by proposing legislation that, if it doesn't pass, might still have an impact down the road. So 3 years ago, I proposed a bill to do loan forgiveness for teachers to pay off the student loans they incurred as education students because they needed that because their teaching salaries weren't very high. And it didn't advance all the way. But this year, a teacher incentive bill, very similar to things that I've proposed in the past, did pass and is headed towards the governor's desk. I hope he signs it. House Bill 3564 provides something like, it provides thousands of dollars over the years for people who are getting their education degree and then going and teaching in our public schools. And we were already seeing the effects of incentives like that. Some of our teacher programs are beginning to build back up again after years of decline. And I'm hopeful that that bill is going to make a real difference in one of our most critical problems, the teacher shortage. I also worked on Holocaust education legislation this year. And while my bill didn't advance, a similar bill out of the Senate has been signed by the governor. That's Senate Bill 1671. I even suggested some edits on that bill, and I signed on as a co-author. Some of the other bills I've worked on include a reform of the Landlord-Tenant Act and a harm reduction, a needle exchange bill I worked on with Republican colleagues. And let's see, I think I've got one more bill, a bill establishing a Route 66 commission, which this one actually does have money attached, and it creates a revenue stream for projects along the historic Route 66 to develop the commerce, tourism, business growth. So I'm excited about that one because 9 miles of old Route 66 pass through my district. And I'm a history guy. Route 66 epitomizes the spirit of the open road in Oklahoma. Those, I guess, that's a good summary of some of the stuff that I've worked on.
That's cool. So what are some bills that you proposed this year, even though they didn't get passed?
Oh, let's see. I proposed a $600 million raise to teacher salaries, which would have given every teacher in Oklahoma a 20% raise. We couldn't find $600 million to do that, though, because we needed to give it to Panasonic. For another 160, I would have given bus drivers, school security, the cafeteria staff, the custodial workers, all those guys, a much needed 20% raise too. Those are two bills that I ran that somehow never made it to committee. Yeah, imagine that. Panasonic, please come to Tulsa. Well, yeah. Please come to Mays County.
Speaking of education, how did you feel about the push for school vouchers this year in the legislature?
Okay, so this is is this a podcast? Do they see the recording?
Yeah, this is being recorded right now, and then I'm
okay. Well, I just made a face for those who are only listening, because vouchers are the enemy. Vouchers are the devil. Death before vouchers is my motto. Vouchers in various forms essentially takes money allocated to public education and gives it to parents to use to pay for private school tuition. Now, 95% of our students are in the public schools, 5% are in the private schools. The way vouchers have worked in other states is that they tend to be given to parents who are already sending their kids to private schools. So it's a subsidy to middle and upper middle class families who are already, and not part of the system. And there's been a recent scandal in the Secretary of Education's office where he was given $8 million of federal gear money to spend on emergency pandemic relief. And what he did was he found a company in Florida that would issue those dollars in little grants to whatever parents applied for them. There was almost no oversight, and a study shows that parents spent those education dollars to buy flat screen TVs, Christmas trees, all these other things, and not for the purpose of education. So that tells me that if we were ever to pass a statewide voucher scheme, that's exactly what would happen. We would take all these public dollars, which if we applied them to the public schools, then they're subject to reporting standards. There's an OCAS system that allows us to account for every line item of spending. There's a political process for reviewing it and making corrections. Now, if we took all those dollars out of the public school system, which is transparent and accountable, and put them in the private schools, well, it's anybody's guess. There are very good private schools out there doing very good things, but there might also be private schools that open up overnight to take those public school dollars and then to pretend to teach kids. Do we all remember what happened with EPIC? That was a public charter school, but it had a private management organization through which we funneled hundreds of millions of dollars that seem to have gone into the pockets of its two founders. The state auditor has called that the worst misappropriation of state funds in Oklahoma history. We want to see that on steroids? Vote for vouchers.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself.
I've had some practice.
And how do you feel about the abortion bills that they've been passing in the legislature?
Well, I had a conversation today. I had this man was introduced to me as, "Oh, this is the biggest conservative you're going to meet today." And I was at the PGA, so you might meet some big conservatives there. And he was like, "Well, I'm a constitutional conservative, and I believe Roe v. Wade should be overturned, so we can leave it up to the states." And then he allowed. But, I do think that people probably should have access to abortion the first 22 weeks, and there should be exceptions and stuff. And I'm like, oh, really? That's interesting. Because the state you live in does not allow any of those. Under our law, There are almost no exceptions. We're going to start at the beginning of fertility, which means I think we're going to our small government state is going to be tracking menstrual cycles, and there are exceptions allowed under some of the laws, but they require you, for example, to file a police report if you want to be able to claim that you were raped. 70% of sexual assault victims do not report their crimes, and many of them live in close proximity to their attackers, and there'd be considerable risk if they did. So that means under the law we just passed, what you might call it the Texas Heartbeat Hold'em Bill, we're going to force a lot of women, a lot of people with unwanted pregnancies to carry those pregnancies to term. And really, in a startling moment in the debate over SB 1647, one of the Republicans got up and said, "Where's the accountability? We always talk about ending abortion, but do we do anything to take care of the people after they're born?" And then he criticized the churches. You know, if we're ever serious about tithing and we tithed our 10%, maybe we could take care of people, but we never do that. All we do is pass these abortion laws. And that was interesting because this was the first abortion vote we've held since the SCOTUS leak. And it demonstrates a fracture in the Republican Party. The Republicans have been free to vote on the most extreme abortion bills because they've never been held accountable for those votes, because Roe v. Wade has prevented those laws from becoming enforceable. Now, we're going to establish they like to say abolitionist stance. I would say prohibitionist stand. We're going to prohibit abortions, and we're going to inherit all kinds of problems. We're going to have to accept all the consequences of that decision. Many Republicans don't agree with that, and they voted for all these abortion bills because that was the price of being in the caucus. And there was no cost before because they weren't enforceable. Now there's going to be a cost. And as I said at the beginning of this little tirade, that's a big fracture point for the Republican Party. The party of small government, the party of individual liberty, has just embraced a big government prohibitionist stance. And here's a pop quiz for you, Gregory. Mm-hmm. How many amendments to the Constitution have restricted rather than enlarged our rights?
I don't believe there are any necessarily.
You're correct in the present tense. In the past tense, there's one: prohibition of alcohol.
Yeah.
How many amendments have been repealed?
That one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they repealed it because we don't remember this part of the history, but people didn't like prohibition, not just because they wanted to drink, though a lot of us wanted to drink, but because they realized
problems.
And it required federal enforcement, and they didn't like the federal enforcement. Now we're going to have state enforcement in all the states that outlaw abortion, and that's going to be an intrusive big government. Be careful what you wish for, folks. You're about to get it.
Yep. It's terrible. So now a non-political question.
Okay.
What's your favorite type of history or era of history?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I studied American history in college. I taught European and Asian history in high school. They're fascinating. I guess here's my politician's dodge. Every type of history you study better informs your understanding of all the other parts of history. There's the old saying, how can you know England if you know only England? And the Quran says, seek ye wisdom, yea, even to China. So I grew up with a Western Civ background, Catholic schools, et cetera, Greco-Roman tradition up to Europe and colonialism, the expansion of Western Civ around the world, maybe with the idea that America represented the best part of that tradition and that its job was to impart democracy and liberty around the world. You can argue that one. But then I studied Chinese history. And China has, for most of our history, been the wealthiest, largest, and most technologically advanced civilization on the planet. And we barely acknowledge that in our Western studies of history. But if you study Asian history and you look at the traditional cultures that flourish there, and you maybe study pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas, cultures in Africa, then that European Western gloss that gets placed over our history in our high school history textbooks starts to fray. You realize that if all you do is study Western civilization, you don't understand history very well.
Yeah.
So I guess I will say that my favorite part of history to study is that part I don't know yet, because it's going to better inform my comprehensive understanding of world history, which is, after all, the sum of the human experience. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I've always said to people that my favorite parts of history, or my favorite type of history, is mostly American history, but like after Reconstruction.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
I think a lot of that, because of the way that it gets taught in school,
Oh, yeah.
because you have 8th grade, we teach up until the Civil War, and then junior year, we teach Reconstruction to the present.
Mhm.
But
Kind
because
of a
of
gap
that,
there.
yeah, but because of that, we don't really get to, like, because there's so much packed into what we have to learn, we don't end up learning it all very well. Because I
No.
remember whenever I was in high school, we learned everything pretty well up until about a little after World War II. Then we had to start cramming for the state test.
Oh, yeah, because state testing, drop everything.
Exactly. And,
Vietnam, what?
say what?
So what's Vietnam? We don't get that.
Exactly. So, and it's kind of the same way now. I mean, occasionally some teachers are able to make it into the later parts of history, but for the most part, they don't really get a full grasp of post World War II history in America or in anything.
Yeah.
And that's like almost a third, if not half, of the state test, because I've taken that test and I was like, oh, well, I know a lot of these answers to things because I read up on history and politics all the time, but I know my classmates don't.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
If there are any history teachers listening to this, your job is not really to prepare them for that test. Your job is to get students to think history is interesting, so they'll keep on learning after you run out of time to teach them. So
yeah,
John Hope Franklin was a graduate of Booker T, and he was the first person to receive the Presidential Freedom Award. He grew up in segregation. He was a classmate of another great American historian, Daniel Boorstin, or they were both Tulsa graduates in the same year. And he went on to revolutionize history by demonstrating that you can't understand American history if you don't understand African American history, and that needs to be created as a separate field that one can study, and it needs to be imbued into our white history of America. And he's right. American history doesn't make any sense if you don't study the history of peoples of color. Here's, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, why are Americans different from Europeans? Why is American history not just an extension of European history? And the answer is people of color. It's our encounters with Native Americans. It's our import of African slaves, and it's the immigrant tradition that all continue to stimulate and change and enrich and nourish American history so that it's truly unique. So if all you do is study white guys, you're not really seeing the American history.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing that I try to like tell kids whenever I talk about history with them. And I remember, and sometimes it's kind of scary whenever I like hear them talk about certain things when it comes to history, because it's like I feel like they should know these things. There was this one girl I had in class. She recently, not recently, but like she moved from Texas, and she's Mexican, and she said in class to me that she doesn't like that she has to take Oklahoma history because she's not from here. And she said, I don't want to have to learn about a bunch of Indians. And I'm like, oh, well, okay.
Let me
And
tell
then
you
I
about
said,
Mexico.
right. And then I said to her, I said, you do realize like you're an indigenous person just like they are. It's just different parts of the country or the
Yeah.
continent. And it's a shared history, just different areas.
Right.
And I think she kind of knew that, but when I said it to her, she was like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that then.
Yeah, I know.
but I thought that was funny because a lot of people don't like realize that because of the way that the Spanish conquered southern South America and Central America,
especially Mexico, Cortez.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And then, you know, France and England and a lot of the other European countries colonized the northern part of the Americas. That's what makes the histories of those people different, and how we view them now as different people, even though they're all indigenous to the Americas. They're all indigenous people. But yeah, and what were you about to say?
Oh, well, I recently taught a class at TU, and I had a Mexican American student and I had a Spanish student, as in she was a Spanish kid studying in America. He was afraid to talk to her. The language, it was, I don't think I can understand. Yeah. So, I mean, Mexican history is not Spanish history. It's because it's been mixed. We have this tradition of mingling. The Mexicans just as much as the people of El Norte have. We're all mixed, and we scrambled our history up, and there's oppression and there's injustice and there's liberation. It's all part of our themes, and it makes us unique and different and ought to be embraced rather than suppressed.
Yeah, and I remember another thing for me is I like talking about Shawnee because I'm from Shawnee, and how it's the interesting fun facts about Shawnee and its history that I know. Like Sonic, the first Sonic was here. You know, the last Democratic governor was from here.
Yep.
You know, those types of things. And I remember this one student, this is in Oklahoma City, but they said that they'd never heard of Shawnee, even though they'd lived in Oklahoma their entire life. I was like,
oh my gosh,
Oklahoma City, you've never heard of Shawnee? Like, that is
come on.
And right. And I just started talking to them about Shawnee and kind of like gave them like a mini history lesson about Shawnee. And at the end of the conversation, they're like, wait, you just kind of gave me like a lecture about Shawnee and it wasn't boring. That was actually cool. And I was like, you're welcome.
So Tecumseh and the Prophet were members of the Shawnee tribe, and they formed the last great federation to try to halt American expansion into the Ohio River Valley. And there's an old story that Tecumseh, that the Prophet, who was his brother, is the reason why American presidents American president elect in the year ending in 0 tended to die in office. It was called the Prophet, Curse of the Prophet, because Harrison and in 1820, 1840, 1860, that was Lincoln, 80, all the way up to 1980, every president elected in the 0 year died in office. And Reagan took a bullet in 1981, and it was kind of a close call. So I guess that was the end of what they call the Prophet's curse.
And then for Bush, he wasn't actually elected because the Supreme Court appointed him. So that's
he had a dangerous run-in with a pretzel at one point. Let's just say the curse wore off eventually. But Tecumseh, the Prophet, and their stand at the Battle of Tippecanoe is a really fascinating part of American history. And then, there's the Shawnee, the absentee Shawnee, and the Eastern Shawnee. What's all that history about? It's kind of fascinating, and it's very American, and we all ought to know it.
Yeah. I remember that's also the funny thing is a lot of students, and I think a lot of Oklahomans in general probably don't know this. And I'm actually kind of surprised about this. They don't know, like I've had someone that is like say to them, I'll say like, name 5 names of tribes, just any names of tribes. And they can't think of any. And I'm like all of Oklahoma, like
Mm,
anywhere in
mm,
Oklahoma, you've probably driven on a street that was named after a tribe.
mhm,
There's several different towns named after tribes, several
mhm.
different counties, like
Tulsa,
mhm.
Cherokee
Yes,
County, Creek County. Oh my gosh,
Potawatomi County,
they're all
Seminole
Indian.
County,
Yep.
Muskogee County. Yeah,
So
it's and yeah, it's
I was
wild.
one of the nice things about being a teacher is that you had to stay in contact with your students. And I taught a couple of students maybe 15 or 20 years ago now, and their mom passed away during the pandemic, and not of other causes, but they had to hold the memorial service sometime later. And they asked me to say a few words. And I had to do some research because she was of the Lenni Lenape tradition. And I learned something about their customs and their names. And it occurred to me as I was going along that the Lenni Lenape were based in Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. And I grew up with towns like Parsippany and Whippany that were Lenni Lenape names. So the next time I was back visiting my family in New Jersey, I started taking pictures of street signs and town names and sending them back to my students in honor of their mom. And it was just a funny connection I had, New Jersey and Oklahoma. Oklahoma is important because all these Indian tribes that have settled in Oklahoma were displaced and moved from all over the eastern and northern parts of the country, really all over the place, and were settled in Oklahoma. Funny how we didn't end up making Oklahoma truly a place governed by Indian sovereignty. So now I have another history fact that's going to bake your noodle.
Okay,
Do you know who Annie Burkhart was?
off the top of my head.
Wait till Killers of the Flower Moon come out. She was the first noted murder in the Osage Reign of Terror. So she was somebody, they drove her into a ravine and put a bullet in her head, and it was some time before they found her. And after that, the murders began to increase and gained attention. I'm not sure Annie Burkhart was the first one killed, but she's the first one mentioned in the book Killers of the Flower Moon. And you probably have heard of the Tulsa Race Massacre, right?
Yeah.
They happened in the same month. Annie Burkhart was murdered 3 weeks before the Tulsa Race Massacre. Is there a conspiratorial connection between these facts? No. There was no one guiding agency between those, but I'll tell you, both the Osage Reign of Terror and the Tulsa Race Massacre happened to minority groups that lacked political clout and legal protection. And that's the connection. People did terrible acts of violence to them because they could, because there would be no consequences. And really, they were about roughly of the same size, about 300 people killed in each case. And very few consequences for the killers. They got, a couple of the people associated with the murder of Annie Burkhart, and maybe they got the killers associated with about 11 to 20 of the Osage murders, but there were probably 300. So that means there are people walking around Oklahoma today whose ancestors profited from acts of violence against minority people who lacked political clout and legal protection. And they walk around as if they had earned their fortunes. It's like my friend Eric Proctor used to say, there's people who were born on third base and thought they'd hit a triple. There are people in Oklahoma whose wealth is based on violence, theft. And that's why when we have these debates about Oklahoma history, the descendants of these people do not want us to talk about anything that might make people feel guilty, because they should.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult. It's very fraught history. We cover it all with the Sooner myth, the idea that settlers came to Oklahoma, found an empty wilderness, and made a prairie paradise out of it. No, there were people here already. Many of them were displaced. Laws were broken. The criminals, the people who broke the laws, profited and were never brought to consequence.
Yeah. And
sorry, this was supposed to be a fun interview. I think I brought us down a little bit.
No, it's still fun. Like talking about history and stuff
Mm.
like that.
And I mean, what I mean to say about all that is that it has present implications for the way we carry out our politics. House Bill 1775, which we passed last year, banning critical race theory, is designed to keep people from questioning the Sooner myth.
Yeah, and what else was I about to say? Because you talked about how people came here and there was already people here. How there's I think we say it's 12 or 13 black all black towns that were
Yep.
here before.
Mhm.
And that's also interesting because I
Yep.
didn't know. I knew about it whenever I was younger, but I
Mhm.
didn't know where all those cities were.
Mm.
And one of them is not too far from me. It's called Brooksville.
Mhm.
And in learning about it whenever I was an adult, I was like, I had no idea this existed. And
I think we've
learning,
passed a measure about a civil rights trail to commemorate the all black towns. Boley is a really important one because it's right next to the Honey Springs battle site, which was one of the big Civil War battles that was fought in the Indian Territory, won by the Union by the Kansas Colored Volunteers. So Black soldiers fighting for the cause of freedom helped to secure Union control of the Indian Territory.
yeah. And another thing I've been fascinated with lately is Wowoka and Seminole Native tribe and stuff like that, and the freedmen, because my dad grew up in Wowoka, and learning about like the founding of Wowoka is like really cool. Like I didn't know that it was founded by like freedmen, Seminole natives, and even to this day, like I think what is it, like almost 60% of Wowoka is still either Black or Native American. And there's a lot of overlap there because of, some of them are freedmen who are descendants of Seminoles. And yeah, it's really cool.
I saw a professor do a study where he pointed to certain common languages and customs that were present in West Africa, the Eastern Carolinas, and Northern Florida, and in Seminole County. And the connection was slaves taken to the Eastern Seaboard, escaped, joined the Seminole tribe. Seminole, I think, comes from an old word meaning refugee or something, the idea that it was the place where all the escaped people went. And then the Seminoles were sent on their trail of tears. They carried West African customs with them to Oklahoma. And you can find little traces of that in words and turns of phrases and ways people prepare their rice and stuff. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. It's cool history.
Yeah.
But yeah, my last question here is, what kind of music do you listen to?
Oh my gosh. Oh, let's see. That's a good question because I'm a tin ear, and I just went to the Robert Earl Keen concert. That was kind of fascinating. It's his last concert, some old Texas singer-songwriter stuff. I listen to a lot of folk music. I like music that's got a lot of culture and history to it. But I also grew up in the 80s when all the good music was being written. So, you got to listen, got to have some Journey and some Bruce Springsteen and, everything good was made in the 80s. So, I listen to old music is the answer. And yeah, you mentioned modern groups to me, and I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah.
Well, define modern though, because
anything in this century.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
Because whenever I talk to students, like high school students, about music, even to them, stuff that was out when I was like a little kid is considered old to them.
Yeah.
And I just can't wrap my head around that.
I know.
kids telling me they don't know who Lincoln Park is, or Lincoln Park is old. I'm like,
Yeah.
how? Like that's barely 20. Oh, never mind.
It'll happen to you too, kids. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because so like the whole old thing is different, or because I mostly listen to older music. I mean, it kind of just gets older from where I used to start at, because I think whenever I was in high school, I mostly listened to stuff from the mid to late 90s, early to mid 2000s, like rock and metal.
Yeah.
And bands that came out around that time. And now over the past like year or so, I've been getting into a lot of old school hip hop. And as a result of looking up a lot of the samples that were in that stuff, I've been getting into some of the old like funk music from like the 60s and 70s too. So a lot of Public Enemy, Eric B and Rakim, and then like some James Brown songs, Sly and the Family Stone.
Oh yeah, that's good stuff. That speaks to your good character.
Yeah, it's and then Alanis Morissette as well.
Oh yeah, she was transformational. Oh, yeah. And I'm a sucker for Kate Bush, British singer of the 80s, sort of the British Madonna. Man, she could sing. She can sing.
Yeah. So for me, whenever I hear people say I remember some kids told me they listened to old stuff, and then they said Bruno Mars, and I was like, how is Bruno Mars old to you? That was 5 or 6 years ago when he came out. Like, that was not long ago.
When you're 18, 5 or 6 years ago is middle school.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
And now for me, middle school was over 10 years ago.
Yep.
Because in August, it'll be 10 years since I started high school.
You know who was president when I was in middle school? Jimmy Carter.
Yeah. Yep. And Obama was president whenever I was in middle school.
But it's funny. I mean, for those of you who are listening who are not 100 years old like myself, you might think about the impressions that are being made on you now that are going to be with you decades from now, how your ideas start to form through your contact, your inspirations, the people you look up to. And, that's a good thing. You should stay true to those values that you're developing right now, even as you keep an open mind and are prepared to keep growing and adapting. Because, as an old white guy in the Democratic Party, I need to recognize where the future is and not just look back to the past. And part of our responsibility as an older generation is to be prepared to give way and yield to the rising values and impulses and desires of the next generation. You got to make room. And that's one thing I'm afraid we don't do very well in politics. Our politics tends to be centered around the values of the oldest Oklahomans without enough willingness to concede room to the next generation of Oklahomans. And to some extent, that means the past robs the future a little bit. We should make sure young people are out there registered to vote and participating in every election.
Yeah, because a lot of people, I think this is even more true now than it was whenever I was younger. A lot of people, whenever they graduated high school, they really, really, really wanted to leave Oklahoma or like prepare to leave Oklahoma once they graduate college or something of that nature. And I still see that mentality with high school students now. They say, why would I want to stay here if I don't have to? Like, there's no reason to stay here. And, it's less, I do agree that it's about making sure they have a say and have a voice in what happens with our political or with our politics and our government and whatnot. But also, I think because a lot of them, that's not where their mind is at. For them, it's just they just see what's around them, and then they decide, there's nothing they can do about that except for leave, or leaving is the easiest thing they could do. We as older people, I put myself in that, even though I'm technically still young, we need to make sure that we give them incentives to stay here or to want to stay here whenever they do graduate high school or graduate college, because even if they're not thinking of it in a way that we are as politicians or candidates, as we're needing to make sure that they're registered to vote and being able to have a say. We just need to make sure that they are wanting to stay. They can look around them and say, there's a reason to stay here.
There are plenty of reasons to stay here. Let's go back to Oklahoma's populist roots. This is the land of Woody Guthrie and Kate Barnard and the Green Corn Rebels. And maybe it's time for another rebellion. Young people, maybe you don't need to change your location. Maybe you need to change Oklahoma.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right on.
Well, thank you for coming on. Where can we find you on social media, and what is your campaign website?
You can find me apologizing for my historical mistakes on Twitter at Waldron for OK. And you can find me on Facebook in my famous 5-paragraph ponderings at Waldron for OK. And you can always look me up at www.waldronforok.com. Or run into me on the street and say hello. That's always fun.